Now available in paperback and Kindle. Vampires stalk the darkness of the Eternal Night. Get your copy of Eternal Night in paperback and Kindle on Amazon.com.
I'm just gonna say it. A lot of today's comics are lame. And the reason why a lot of today's comics are lame is because a lot of these comic book writers and comic book artists really don't know how to write an action sequence. Now, in a lot of today's modern comic books, the action sequences are really bland and the action in them feels really forced. So there's really no sense of movement in many of today's comics because many comic book writers and many comic book artists really don't understand how the human body moves and they don't know how to make the human body move in dynamic fashion in most of their comics. And it seems like something happened over the last couple of years because back when I was buying comics in the late 70s up until the mid 1990s, artists knew how to make comics really move and they knew how to make characters that really were dynamic in a static pose. So they would be in a static pose, but as they were in that static pose, it felt like they were moving. And I remember looking at the art from legendary comic book artists like Jack Kirby, John and Sal Buscema, John Romita Sr., and other legendary comic book artists like George Perez, whose work on New Teen Titans, Fantastic Four, and Avengers just shows you how dynamic action can be, or artists like John Byrne on X-Men, who could show you how you can just literally make action look like a photograph and practically come to life. And then there were other artists out here like Mark Silvestri on X-Men, whose art really looked like it was just practically jumping off the page. Jim Lee on X-Men, his art looked like it came off the page. And Rob Liefeld on New Mutants. I mean, back in the day, we had really dynamic art that practically popped off the page and it made the characters larger than life. And I believe the reason why we have that art looking larger than life is because many of these artists were taught to think big. Because when you're doing comic books are supposed to be big, especially superhero comics, because superheroes are larger than life people and they're supposed to be a grand spectacle and they're supposed to be exaggerated in every way, shape, or form. So a lot of artists back in the day, they would make these characters bigger, grander, and larger than life, and that's what made these images practically pop off the page and look like they were coming to life as you were turning the page. But these days, we're not really seeing a lot of artists really give us these big, dynamic pictures in comics. What we're getting are these very bland looking pictures, and I believe partially that has something to do with the way a lot of today's artists grew up, because a lot of today's artists didn't grow up like I did in the from the late 70s to the early 90s. They did not really grow up with the types of media I grew up with, where we had a lot of action movies and we had a lot of things like wrestling going on, and you could actually see the human body in action. Because when I go out here and I write action sequences for stories like The Man Who Rules the World, John Haynes, The Man with Nothing to Lose, John Haynes, A Conversation with Death, Isis, Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, and other Isis stories like Isis, Samurai Goddess, I would take frames of reference from things that I grew up watching, like karate movies in the 70s, things like wrestling in the 80s, all the way to right now. I still watch wrestling. And I would also take frames of reference from action movies like American Ninja, Jean-Claude Van Damme movies, Steven Seagal movies, Star Wars, and all sorts of, and movies like Terminator 2 Judgment Day, because when you watch the human body in action, this helps you understand how the human body moves, so that when you go out here and you write a fight, you can choreograph that fight so that each character's movements, when you present it panel to panel, can come across as bold and dynamic. So when I would go out here and I would start writing an action sequence like Isis, Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, I wrote several action sequences in that story, I had to choreograph the fight sequences so that they would move from paragraph to paragraph. But if I did it as a comic, I wanted it so that they would move from panel to panel. And a lot of today's comic book writers, I believe they're not really studying enough about movement of the human body to understand how to make a character move in a big, bold, and dynamic fashion inside the pages of a comic. So what I'm seeing from a lot of people today is a lot of stiff and really forced movement as related to the body. And I believe a lot of people are working with things like digital 3D models. And a digital 3D model is not going to teach you how to make a body move. All it's going to do is give you a static figure as a reference, and that static figure is not good enough for a comic. Comics are supposed to be big, they're supposed to be bold, they're supposed to be larger than life, and the characters in comics are supposed to be bigger and larger and more exaggerated than your average human being. They're supposed to pop off the page, and the sequences when they have them in fight scenes are supposed to be absolutely grand spectacles. But when I look at a lot of today's comic book action sequences, the sequences are really they're really smaller in scale, and there's not much dynamism inside of these sequences. It's just usually maybe one, maybe two punches, but nothing really bold and dynamic. You really don't feel the hits like you would in a John Byrne comic or a George Perez comic or even a Jim Lee comic, where you would just practically feel the action from the way it was drawn. Today's action, it just really feels subdued, and then they wash it with these colors that are muted, and it just doesn't pop. I mean, I was reading Iron Man #3 by Christopher Cantwell and Cafu, and you have this wonderful Alex Ross armor and that practically explodes when Alex Ross draws it and paints it, but in the way it was colored, it just looks so muted and subdued, and then the action sequences were so slow, it didn't really give you that dynamic feel. I mean, this armor that Alex Ross designed, this as I call it, retro mod armor, it really has a great look, but the problem is that you have writers who don't have enough imagination to visualize something big or visualize something grand, and then you have the artists who can't really execute on something big and grand because they don't understand how that works. And again, the reason why I believe they are having a hard time is because they're not really studying the right reference material. Now, again, when I go out here and I do an action sequence for a story, whether it be a John Haynes, The Man with Nothing to Lose, or John Haynes, A Conversation with Death, or Isis, Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, or Isis, Samurai Goddess, or I do a story sequence like Eternal Night, I tend to visualize big because I want my readers to see it like a big budget action movie or a big spectacle like WrestleMania, or see something big like the moment when Undertaker threw Mankind off the top of the cage in '98's Hell in a Cell. I want you to think about something big, and I oftentimes, if I think about something big, it's like I think about Jim Ross saying, "By God," so he's broken in half, something huge where you're just going, wow, look at this. Look at these heroes. Look at the amazing stuff that they're doing. And we're not getting that type of imagination as I see it from a lot of today's comics, because a lot of the writers really, as I see it, don't know how to write an action sequence. And the reason why they don't know how to write an action sequence is because they're not studying the right reference material. I mean, if you really want to study reference material, again, you have to study things like karate movies, and you have to study things like wrestling and things like wrestling matches, and you have to study things like fight sequences in action movies like Terminator 2 Judgment Day, RoboCop, um, a lot of the lower budgeted movies like American Ninja, American Ninja 2. I mean, I sit there and I would study, and Jean Claude Van Damme movies, you have to study how the body moves so that when you write the story, you can choreograph action that becomes larger than life. You don't want to give people small scale fights because small scale fights don't really sell. Big scale fights sell, and big scale fights are what made comics what they are. I mean, when I think of big scale fights, I think of things like Avengers versus Count Nefaria in Avengers Volume 1, issue 164 through 166. That is a just incredible sequence of action sequences. I mean, that is a fight that just feels bigger than life, and you're just hanging on the edge of your seat, just reading through those 3 issues because the action in them is so big and incredible. And if you really want to see other big action sequences, you need to look at things like New Teen Titans by George Perez and Morris Wolfman. I mean, that book had some absolutely huge action sequences and action fights. Same thing with John Byrne's Fantastic Four, Walt Simonson's Thor, Michelini and Bob Layton's Iron Man. These are the comics that when you read them and you look at the action sequences are big, bold, larger than life, and they feel just epic and grand. And we really need more of those if you want to sell comics, because one of the things I believe that's preventing comics from selling well in today's marketplace is the fact that a lot of the action sequences they're really weak, they're really lame, and in 3 to 5 pages you don't really get that big, bold, dynamic feel as related to the action. You get this kind of small scale, just stuff kind of happens, but it's happening for one, no reason, and two, it's happening, without any sort of dynamism to really get you into it. And that all has to do with the fact that a lot of today's writers don't have enough imagination, they don't have enough vision, and they don't really study much as related to the movement of the human body, and they don't really know how to choreograph a sequence to make that sequence really flow into a fight scene that practically tells an absolutely fantastic story. So when I look at today's comic action sequences, they really lack, and that's the reason why a lot of comics are having a hard time selling, because a lot of today's writers, they grew up in environments where all they did was sit there and talk to their friends, but that's not what people paying money to see in a comic is 20 pages of people talking about stuff. No, people pay money to see people kick butt in a comic, and they pay money to see large-scale action sequences, epic-scale action sequences, and that's what a lot of comic fans aren't getting from today's comics. I mean, we're just getting these neutered, small-scale sequences, but we really need to get back to the big, grand scale of action sequences we got in the late 70s and throughout the 80s and early 90s from artists like George Perez, John Byrne, Ron Lim, Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, and many other comic artists who just gave us these big, huge fight scenes and big, huge action sequences. We've got to get back to that because comic books are supposed to be larger than life, and people want to see larger than life stories with larger than life characters, and we want to see big panels because that's what draws people in, and that's what helps you sell a comic, and that's what sells a good story. And we need writers with, again, that big, vivid imagination to give us those big, vivid pictures and a big, vivid, grand scheme as related to comic book storytelling. Now, I'm releasing my first comic book story in this book, Eastern Blast from the Past. And if you want to check out how I do action sequences in comics, you can pick up Eastern Blast from the Past on Amazon.com in paperback today, or you can wait until the Kindle comes out on Black Friday. And if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.